So in our previous video, Art Journeys Part 1, we looked at a particular society, Western society, and a journey that Western society went on with its art for quite a lengthy period of time. Now, this time we're going to look at another advanced society that didn't go on the same journey as Western art. Just a recap, we called that journey of Western art tendency towards illusion. This society doesn't go on that journey, and the one we're going to look at is Japan, Japanese society. Now, I'm not attempting the impossible task of giving an entire history of a very sophisticated culture. I'm just giving the relevant grounding and signposting. So, here are the Japanese islands. These islands have been inhabited for at least 12,000 years. That's the age of the earliest physical evidence that's been found. These early inhabitants have already gone against the grain of history because they were creating pottery, example here, before they had agriculture. Doesn't happen that way around. This may be significant, as we shall see. The second major migration happens from around 250 BC, when people come via the Korean peninsula to populate the islands. This is called the Yayoi period. And any Japanese viewers, I'm going to be pronouncing a lot of words really badly. Please forgive me. The people who arrive in the Yayoi period bring important knowledge of agriculture and metalwork. Now, agriculture brings static societies, and technologies like metalwork bring specialization. Once there's specialization, you usually end up with social hierarchies, and this is what happened in Japan, which a few centuries down the road appoint their first emperors. This is still a pre-literate culture, a pre-literate society I should say, but one with complex technologies. This means that methods of making things can't be written down, so rituals are used to commit important processes to memory. The process, for instance, the ritual, the movement, becomes part of the piece, the item being made, for instance, a work of art. Japan's axial age is the period between about 500 and 800 AD. This is when things of significant impact enter its culture. They come through contact with the big ancient empire on the mainland, the Chinese Empire, and the Korean kingdoms. And these are Buddhism, Confucianism, and the adoption of a writing system from the Chinese. Buddhism and Confucianism are to Japanese culture what Hellenism and Christianity were to the European. In both cases, the impact is wider reaching, saturates far much more than simply to its devotees, people who become Buddhists. It's far greater than that. Taking Buddhism first, two important things to remember. First, that Japan has received Buddhism indirectly. It originates in northern India, but has come to Japan via China and the Korean kingdoms. Secondly, this is already 1,000-year-old Buddhism. It has developed in many directions already, and that's Buddhism with a capital B. The belief in Buddhas is older still. Now, Japan is not a blank canvas. Buddhism is synchronized with the existing belief of the Japanese islands, the worship of kami. Kami means a form of a deity, a nature spirit, perhaps is a good translation. I hesitate to call it Shinto because historians don't agree as to whether it's rightly called Shinto at this stage. But it is what becomes Shinto, the practice of maintaining a reverent and favourable relationship with nature. An influence of Buddhism on art is that the Japanese start to make images of kami. They had not visually represented them before, but we now start to see them as visible beings, like these figurines coming up on the screen now. Just like visible beings that you see the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas that are found on Buddhist mandalas, which Japanese people begin to see and make their own of. Here's a Japanese Buddhist mandala. The only influence of Hellenism, in fact, on Japanese culture is a visual one, and it's very narrow and it's very specific. It's the Greco-Buddha. So Greek style had been adopted into Buddha images in India, and then this gets copied further afield. So here's a Japanese Greco-Buddha, who even had a head at one time. This, of course, is not the wide-reaching influence into many spheres of life, like Hellenism was in the West. Very narrow, and kind of second-hand again, of course. The second big import of the Axial Age is Confucianism. This also comes about 1,000 years after the life of Confucius, but more directly, either direct from its place of origin, from China, or via Korean expressions of it. Confucianism is strong on logical consistency. A difficulty there is that inconsistency was also seen as divine, because in the Kojiki, the book that records the stories of the gods, you see those characteristics in those gods. Well, the tough job of synchronizing things that don't go together easily is something that creates cultural identities, and this was the case in Japan. It nurtures a thinking society. The same thing happened in medieval Europe when the clergy wanted to maintain the high science of Aristotle and Ptolemy alongside Christianity, two things that really don't fit together. And from that came the practice of scholasticism. This same challenge of synchronization applied to the third of these significant imports. Japanese was a long-existing spoken language that adopted a writing system from the Chinese. And they were a far from obvious fit, but the challenges again birthed creativity. This leads us on to something that's very prominent when you look at Japanese art from over centuries. That's the strength of line work. The strength of line work that is very evident in Japanese art is related to the adoption of the Chinese writing system. Why? Because in both cases a brush is used. So while in Western art of the same period the painter is a specifically skilled artisan who can use a brush, in Japan use of a brush was a wider practice because brushes were used for writing. If brush use and dexterity are more commonplace, there is a greater appreciation for those who excel at it, and line work would be admired, and so you would want to see it in pictures, and that trend continues down through the centuries. Reverence and seeking a good relationship with nature gave Japanese culture greater sensitivity in learning the properties of nature's materials. The clearest example is that wooden buildings last, like the Horioji temple here, a building made from wood that has been standing since the 8th century. Once stone was used for building in Europe, wood became a largely practical material, fairly temporary and disposable, and used for structures not expected to last, like scaffolding, battle machinery. By contrast, the Japanese continued to use wood, and understanding of woods meant they could maintain and repair it. It maintains a high value in a more reverent way, rather than just based on the function. This can also be seen in printing. Japan doesn't inherit printing from the printing press of 15th century Europe, but from woodblock printing from 7th century China. This makes sense. If you're attuned to the properties of wood, you would know which woods hold and transfer ink the best and which species of wood can be carved the best if you want to make intricate printing blocks. In Europe, the focus of printing is more on the written word. This is mostly to do with the Reformation. In Japan, word and image go more naturally together, and of course the distinction between writing and drawing is not so great. Now, we've looked at Japan's axial age, about 500 to 800 AD, and I think it's significant to notice the difference between its following centuries and those of Western culture following its axial age, which is roughly the time of Socrates to the time of Christ. Europe experiences an estrangement with a lot of its axial age, and has a kind of second axial age in the Renaissance, when it reacquaints itself with it. In Japan, however, despite a great deal of upheaval, such as the seizing of power by the shogunate in the 12th century and many civil wars following, there's never an estrangement from their major cultural influences, just developments from them. And the change can be seen in pace. In Europe, there's a kind of insecurity about the loss of contact that leads to a sense of urgency, an urgency to catch up. In Japan, there isn't a sense of something to catch up with, so cultural change is calmer. Also significant is that the Western tendency to illusion we looked at last video is a direct impact on the viewer, even a shock possibly. And in comparison, the chief spoken languages of Europe are more direct. In Japanese spoken language, even direct things are expressed indirectly, so impact in that sense would not be favourable. That means it would not be sought in visual images. Think about the aim of direct language. It's 100% what is said, the finished product. Less direct language places more value on how it is said, as well as what is said. So it notices and values the process. A direct thing that Europeans wanted by the 15th century was direct trade with Japan. They started to seek out sea routes straight to Far Eastern ports, and that's what Christopher Columbus was trying to do. Japan's first significant contact with Europeans was with the Portuguese. That contact was accompanied by the first substantial contact with Christianity, as Jesuit priests travelled with the traders. Not long after, though, the Tokugawa shogun seized power of all of Japan. That's around 1600. And they moved the capital from Kyoto to their base in Edo, the city that is now called Tokyo. The Tokugawa isolated Japan from the rest of the world from 1603 to 1868. This was called the Edo period. This wasn't chiefly to protect and preserve Japanese arts and culture, but it had that effect. When Europeans had first arrived in the previous century, they brought three things: new trade, Christianity, and long-range firearms. The new trade was kept, but was highly restricted and regulated. Japan did trade with one European, the Dutch, who could only come to one port, Nagasaki. The long-range firearms had already brought total imbalance to Japan, but they had been key in the Tokugawa's successful domination, so they were adopted. Christianity had to go. There was no real objection to its beliefs or accompanying culture, but the Tokugawa needed land barons to be dependent on them, and Christianity among land barons could cause outside alliances that they couldn't control, so it was banned during the Edo period. Aside from Christianity, which was a full ban, and foreign travel, which was a ban with very few exceptions, banning things wasn't the usual method. Normally, it was assigning things to one small area where it could be controlled. For instance, the international trade, restricted to Nagasaki. Another example of this was the assigning of a small area for vice, an unofficial lowbrow culture. Edo had an official red light district. It's no electric light, obviously, but we know what that means. Apart from the obvious, the red light district is also where entertainments, later to become central official culture, arose. Kabuki theatre, sumo wrestling, and the famous woodcut prints. These pleasure-focused images became known as ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, a phrase in which there is quite a lot of comment and irony. It refers to foundational Buddhist belief. In one sense, it is the floating world in an anti-Buddhist sense, because it is a self-confessed squandering of life, distracting one from the aims of an engaged, meaningful life. While on the other hand, it's arguably a central concern of Buddhism, to exist in the moment and transcend the noise and cycles of this life. I think it really comes across in the pictures. The subjects can often be chaotic parts of life, but they're portrayed in a genteel, non-chaotic way. Another world-famous Japanese art form is its gardens. These were designed to be places of contemplation, which seems very similar to the Western purpose, but in the case of Japanese gardens, you don't contemplate in a garden, you contemplate the garden. Actually, every step you take within the garden, you see everything in a different arrangement, and they were deliberately designed with that in mind. This is a process as part of the piece again, and of course, the viewer is part of that piece. They process through the garden. The practice is to interpret a garden. So we're back at the language thing again. Space left for interpretation is more in line with the tendency in Japanese spoken language that we already looked at, where even a direct comment is spoken in the way that needs to be interpreted. As we've reached the Edo period, let's look at pictures from that era and note the contrasts with contemporaries in the West. I've already also started to play some music, so think about the contrasts with the music we listened to in the first video. Looking at the pictures first, what do we notice? Outlines are not hidden. They are a strong, deliberate feature. Depth of field. There is depth of field in these images, in places. I'd say enough depth of field to establish it, but other areas are flat, a flat plane. The Japanese pictures are mindful of colour. There's more colour contrasts, especially in the picture on the right. There have been colour choices made for the sake of impact, for expressing the mood of the image, rather than necessarily wanting to be faithful to the contrasts in real life in order to create illusion of on the flat plane. And as we've discussed, the flat plane isn't trying to be hidden anyway. How about the music then? One thing that comes across, I think, from this music is that there is space. Non-playing sections of time are as much the music as the playing sections. We're reminded that the sounds come from an instrument and that a person is playing it. We hear the instrument itself, not just its notes, the resonation of the strings, the decay of the notes, and that's all part of the music. There's no attempt to make us forget the sound is from an instrument, played by a person. In terms of melody, it's more like incidental music. We don't have sound motifs that are developed and returned to, like we're used to in Western classical music of the same time. Incidental music in Western culture is still 2 or 3 centuries away. But here it's already something that exists in the high culture music of the time. It's expressing a moment like incidental music tends to do, rather than like conveying a sort of a narrative. And I'd say the core Buddhist principle of occupying the moment is at work in this music. It constantly arrests your attention back to the music. It doesn't transport you away. So the first thing we notice is that Japanese art and music are not on the same journey towards illusion. There's no attempt to forget that a picture is a picture on a flat surface. Line stays prominent in images. The music also makes no attempt to make us forget that it is music, played on instruments by people. This isn't because Japanese artists and musicians are naive or behind on the journey. They're just not on that journey. The values are different. So let's look at some of those values. The first 3 we'll consider together first. So value number 1, space speaks. Non-busy sections of a piece add to the strength of the image. You can make impact by putting something in a space, but you can equally make impact by putting nothing in a space. Value number 2, colour resonates. We are wired to respond to colour. So which colours it's next to, and how much of a colour in an image has an impacting value. Third value, composition. The subject matter is important, but how it is arranged has high visual value, or high auditory value. Higher concentration areas in contrast with lower concentration, the general dynamic shapes and directions created by the things on the picture plane, they all strengthen the impact of the image. Now I think so far we can say that the greatest works of Western art are often great for the same reasons. They were values that artists recognised. They just weren't necessarily values that were at the forefront until a lot later in the West. Here's just one example. One of the most famous masterpieces, Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne. And here you see all of those things. Space speaks in this picture. You have sections that are nowhere near as busy, and that is really impacting. And then, of course, there's the contrast with more contrast with concentrated, busier parts. Color is pretty much the star of the show, I would say, in this famous painting. There's the azure blue of the sea and the sky off to the left, and there's the really popping sort of pinky mauve colour of the cloth that Bacchus is throwing in the air. These two things really draw the eye. Thirdly, composition. Some of that's directional composition. You look at not just the fact that there's figures in the image, but the kind of the shapes and the directions that they draw your eye towards, and the fact that there is high concentration in certain areas like bottom right, and then lower concentration top left. So just an example of that. Okay, so the fourth major value in Japanese arts is the process, likely because of the importance of it in their history. So as well as visible line work and things we have looked at already, you see this in things like the tea ceremony, where the particular physical movements are part of the ceremony. In Noh theatre, much of the acting is done by masked actors in established movements that the audience recognise. And these plays are performed on very bare sets, again showing that the acting is as much the focus as the narrative. Coming on to another very important thing, needs to be mentioned, Japanese art. It was entirely normal in many world societies for literature aimed at adults to be illustrated, and that includes Europe. In medieval Europe, literature aimed at adults would commonly have illustrations, but this gradually changed after the tendency to illusion, with illustrations becoming restricted to children's books, or images that looked like unfinished pictures, kind of looser work, cartoons. They would be restricted in their suitability towards humour, for instance, political cartoons. And neither were considered to be literature, really, at their time. So this reminds us of the word that means a preparatory drawing or a sketch, cartoon. Now, the Japanese word for sketch is a Japanese word we recognise, manga. Books with this kind of illustration were normal and commonplace in Japan. Books with pictures aimed at adults continue right into the present. Admiring the process means that unfinished work or looser work isn't demoted in importance, as it was in the West. When Japan reopens to the world, not entirely voluntarily, in the 1860s, 19th century artists of the West can access Japanese art, especially through prints by artists like Hiroshige and Hokusai. The impact is huge. So here are some works by Vincent van Gogh, Marie Cassatt and Toulouse-Lautrec as examples of the people who are really influenced by the Japanese prints they get in contact with. And if we return to our picture of Emile Zola that we had in the previous video, and you look up in the top right hand corner, you'll see that Zola has Japanese prints up on his wall. Now this coincides with the time that Western art is no longer on its centuries-old journey towards illusion. That journey isn't really sincerely pursued anymore. And here are three of the many factors that contribute to that change. I think three key ones. First factor, the need for new language to communicate personal experience and the shared experience of modernity. That's one way maybe to define the word modernism. The second factor is the effect of an invention, photography. That really kind of blows the ambition out of the drive to try to create the illusion on the flat plane, because an invention does that so effectively and so easily. And the third factor is the influence of art from outside of the West, including Japan. There's new aesthetics, things like the strength of line, and there's a review of old aesthetics in Western art, like the fact that space speaks, colour resonates, compositions, and really important. Artists are no longer concerned with the magic trick, like they were when there was the drive towards illusion. But that expectation actually often remains in the Western viewer, and I think that's why there can be misunderstanding about art since the 20th century, because artists usually are just trying to say something. but they're still expected to be magicians. And if we think they think they're magicians, then they're not succeeding in that attempt, and we tend to call them charlatans. I think that's often why there's a misunderstanding in that area. Art in which the work is unfinished and potentially finished by the viewer already had a tradition in Japanese art, going down at least from the Japanese garden that we talked about. But it's considered very radical in the West, especially when groups start to attempt that in the West. Groups like Fluxus from the 1950s. But perhaps three participants in that movement, Yoko Ono, Shigeko Kubota, and Takago Sato, didn't see it as so unusual because of their Japanese background, where the Japanese garden had already been doing this for centuries. Today, both cultures are quite altered, but you can see the old roots in an art form for which America and Japan are the two world leaders: animation. In America, due to mostly to its most influential figure, Walt Disney, who was a great innovator while artistically being quite conservative, animation was immediately ambitious in trying to perfect natural movement, naturalism in the image. In Japan, methods such as tracking and zooming in on single images using rostrum cameras and more expressive rather than realistic imagery gave it a characteristic and very popular look of its own. Since the 90s, with digital imaging, American animation has tended to kind of regain those ambitions towards illusion again. Remember we talked about sfumato method, the way of kind of smoothing off and eradicating the outline that Leonardo da Vinci did. Look at what happened in American animation since digital imaging. Here's a couple of popular characters and how they've been reinvented in animation. Sfumato again. Japanese animation uses digital software, but it retains its more stylized imagery and outlined characters. A couple of film stills here are from the most recent Studio Ghibli film, The Boy and the Heron, released only last year. Just to show how up to date that is. It's maintained that stylistic look. And it's not because they can't do Western style animation, but because they see the value in a look informed by a different journey. That's a centuries old journey that's informing how they represent this very up to date and new art form. And the whole world now sees that value. It's Japanese art has been on a journey that has refined it in a particular way that it now makes a contribution to global media that is appreciated by many people. It's really impacting. So there you go. Different journey, different society, different journey. Thanks for watching.